Hello and welcome to this MBL webinar on UK agricultural policy and what's new, and looking perhaps at an update further to the Agriculture Act in 2020 and of course Brexit. As we've now left the European Union and as the UK develops its new agricultural policy in each of the four countries within the UK, it's quite an interesting time to kind of take a bit of a step back and look at how that development is happening and what changes we're seeing to agricultural policy within the UK. And as you know, it's very different kind of landscape to what it was when we had, of course, this overarching common agricultural policy that was being kind of set at a European level, kind of providing perhaps a framework for the way agricultural policy was developing and how we would develop it within the UK. And now what we're seeing with with the development of policy across England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland is actually quite an increasingly diverse kind of range of policies and schemes. And that means that our job as advisors, if we're working in each of those four countries, becomes a slightly more difficult in that we've got to kind of perhaps have one eye on what's happening elsewhere, but also in terms of perhaps understanding the intricacies of what's happening within the particular country that we're practicing, or countries that we're practicing in. And from my point of view, I think it's been really interesting to see that policy kind of landscape develop. And what we'll do in this webinar is take a bit of an overlook or overarching look at the position each of the four countries that we have within the UK, and consider then what things are perhaps pertinent in terms of the development of the law and policy that we've got in each of those four countries. And then towards the end of the webinar, we'll look at what considerations we should have perhaps in advising farmers and landowners, bearing in mind the changes to agricultural policy. And I'll refer to elements in relation to that as we work through the webinar as well. So just to perhaps recap a little bit about the Agriculture Act itself. So as we know, we had an agriculture bill in 2019 and 2021, which took quite a long time, was scrutinised heavily, and we ended up with an Agriculture Act that received royal assent on the 11th of October 2020. And basically what that Agriculture Act does is provide a legislative framework for agricultural policy going forward within the UK, but perhaps more importantly, from a farmer point of view, initially I expect is the framework for how agricultural support schemes would be governed following the UK leaving the EU. And what we saw when the Act was moving through the motions in terms of Parliament, etc., was quite a lot of discussion about, well, what do we want our agricultural policy to look like going forward, and what kind of principles we'd like to see within that. And this is one of the kind of key phrases of that period as well, was public money for public goods, isn't it? And the justification of the support perhaps that would be provided to farmers going forward. But certainly that Agriculture Act and the principles set therein did see and was a step away from perhaps some of the principles that we were used to and had become accustomed to within the common agricultural policy. And this the Act it covers that overarching framework in terms of how things were supposed to work within each of the different countries in the UK. Now, the provisions mainly apply to England, and we're going to look at England specifically in this webinar and consider, how that has developed specifically. But the Act also has powers included in a schedule for Northern Ireland, to enable Northern Ireland to prepare for replacement schemes, and we'll have a look later on at how Northern Ireland is progressing in relation to that. And also there are provisions in the Act that apply to Wales, but those are intended to be temporary in that they have, enable Wales to develop their own agriculture act, and that is something that is now just has been agreed and approved, but is just waiting for royal assent. We'll come on to that later as well. And then the Scottish Government then also have an equivalent, or Scotland also have an equivalent schedule, and the Scottish Government have then introduced legislation in 2019 as well, which proposes to keep farm support approaches largely the same until 2024, and there's discussions ongoing in terms of what comes thereafter, which we'll come on to later. So this Act provides the framework for everything across the UK, but the intention is that Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland are each going to have their own very distinct agricultural policies and support schemes therein as well. And we're going to look in this webinar at how those differ in the different nations. So what we're going to do for the rest of the webinar is talk about each of these different countries and how they have kind of approached, I suppose, these transition periods from a common agricultural policy and the new agricultural policies that are developing in each of those countries, and then we'll look at what's coming next and how that's going to work thereafter. So I suppose it's probably fair to say that England has the most developed post-Brexit agricultural policy, in that the Agriculture Act basically set out in terms of what that framework would look like and what the plan was in terms of transition, etc. And how kind of those outcomes set out in the Act would be delivered going forward. And England made a policy decision very early on that they were going to stop what you might refer to as direct payments, or perhaps we know better as basic payment scheme, as being the scheme that's been delivering those direct payments in the UK under CAP. So between 2021 and 2027, basically they've said, well, we're going to gradually reduce them and eventually stop them completely by 2027. So there's this gradual reduction in relation to those direct payments, and it's been a very clear policy steer that that kind of direct payment, that kind